Hi, and welcome to the Two Texts podcast. I'm here with my co-host John Andrews, and my name is David Harvey. This is a podcast of two friends from two different countries, meeting every 2 weeks to talk about the Bible. Each week we pick one text to talk about, which invariably leads us to talking about two texts and often many more. This season we're taking a long, slow journey through the book of Acts to explore how the first Christians encountered the disruptive presence of the Holy Spirit.
Hi, David. Well, we are back for another episode of Two Text Podcasts, and my goodness, we ended on a bit of a moment there in chapter 19, where you've got approximately, well, we don't know exactly how many, but the hall held up to 12,000 people. So it could be as many as that, or maybe a few less, shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And these boys and girls are going for like 2 hours or something. So a pretty robust finish to our last podcast, and just the power of the mob in the context of that. And my goodness, what do you do in response to that?
All the frenzy of a Liverpool Champions League game or a Taylor Swift concert, I think is
I can't believe you put Taylor Swift in the same sentence as Liverpool Football Club. That's just, I've now got an image in my head that's just so difficult that I'll never get that out. Now, if Taylor Swift wore a Liverpool football shirt, that would be okay. But yeah, there we are. I could see myself at Anfield screaming for Liverpool. I just can't see myself at a Taylor Swift concert. So.
But this image of that sort of volume of people, isn't it? It's quite
Indeed.
something.
It is something.
Quite something.
And
so...
Sorry, I was just going to say, actually, if any of our listeners have ever been to a big sporting event, I mean, the noise can genuinely be deafening. I mean, I've been in a soccer stadium, and the cheers so loud that my ears are ringing. And of course, it's very hard. Even the most passive, introverted person, it's very, very hard to resist the urge of joining in a roaring crowd. There's something quite contagious and influential, and can I say, even in the darkest sense, manipulative about a roaring crowd that draws you in and draws something out of you, in the adrenaline rush that sort of goes for that, even if you're not exactly agreed with what we're roaring about.
Yes, and so fascinating that there's so many people willing to wade into this conversation and attempt to sort of deal with the crowd. I think that line in Acts 19 verse 32, where it says the assembly was in confusion, some were shouting one thing, some another. Most people did not even know why they were there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a better description of what it's like to be in a chaotic mob.
For sure.
But this is what creates so much danger, isn't it? There's, you and I have seen, how soccer games work and football games work in Europe, where the fans are all kept apart to avoid these levels of chaos. And now the crowd are shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And the text that we're looking at today, like the city clerk comes up to try and talk to them. Like it's like everyone's taking in turns to try and sort the situation out.
Absolutely, it is quite remarkable, and this sort of person steps up and sort of brings a dramatic gear change to our story, and probably saves the day for a number of people in that gathering. In terms of his intervention. So we're going to pick the reading up from Acts 19:35, and we're actually going to duck straight into chapter 20, right? We're going to, because although there's a chapter division and a heading division, there is a natural flow from the end of 19 into the early verses of 20, and it's definitely probably worth our while reading through to verse 6 of chapter 20, right?
And maybe just worth remembering even that One of the really interesting things about this piece of text is that Paul's not actually present to this. So these other people are trying to speak there. Paul's been asked not to get involved at this sort of point. Although the text seems to have implied that's not entirely what he wanted.
Surprise.
Yeah, it's true. So verse 35 of Acts 19, it reads like this. The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If, then, Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion since there is no reason for it." And after he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out to Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months. Because some Jews had plotted against him, just as he was about to sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy, also Tychicus, and Trophimus from the province of Asia. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas, but we sailed from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days.
So for our listeners, we have read not only from verse 35 of 19, but we've gone on in to chapter 20, verse 6, and that those two sections, although in two different chapters, fit beautifully together and give us a beautiful flow, which we might cover all of that today in this podcast, or we might split that into two, depending on what goes on here today. I think my first reaction, I was listening to you reading it again, is thank God for the city clerk. I mean, this is a seriously sensible, wise, and it has to be said, courageous person. If we're talking about thousands of people potentially shouting for 2 hours, getting into a sort of a frenzy, I mean, like the opening statement's quite remarkable. The city clerk quietened the crowd. Like, how did he do that? It's like, so this, although he's nameless, and we don't really know much about him other than obviously the research in terms of what his role might have held as a clerk. This person's got some serious stature about them and a sense of weight and authority that he could step into that and quieten the crowd, not just by sheer muscle, but by actually a brilliant argument. I mean, the point that all the points that he makes, although you may disagree with some of his conclusions, it's actually quite brilliant. And you're going, okay, I don't know who this guy is, but he deserves a pay raise right now as a result of that action alone.
Yes, no, I was thinking that the sort of general bravery of him to deal with that. But it's interesting how he frames the argument and how Luke lets him frame the argument. He reports this quite accurately, saying things that Luke quite clearly doesn't agree with. I don't think, even though it's now in Scripture, the Artemis the Great's image fell from heaven. Luke is not is not affirming that. He's giving us this insight into what was said. And I mean, two things that are really interesting, I think, about this passage. One is, all listeners should remember this, by the way. If your church service leader ever asks you to do a public reading and they say it's Acts 20, verse 1, say no, because that list of names is atrocious to have to try and read through. But I think for me, what I wonder if is going on here is Luke's. And you're beginning to see a pattern. I wonder if our listeners hear this pattern, that as much as throughout Acts there is a relatively consistent, slow-burning opposition to the growth of the church. And that opposition is often attempted to be done under legal terms. These never really seem to get any traction. Right? I was thinking about Philippi. Right? There's this sense of something happens in Philippi, but it definitely, you are led to see legally the grounds for the objection were very, very limited, and it was a mob trying to take over the courts. So what's really interesting here is to have a city clerk make that claim for us, right? To have actually the legal system that Paul keeps getting dragged into actually make the point there isn't a legal case here. And that's not to say that Rome is approving of the gospel. It's to say that the gospel is not doing something that registers it as an enemy. Even though we might see that the gospel clearly has some very strong critiques of the way Rome is, Rome is not seeing it as a riotous threat, if that makes sense.
Oh, it's absolutely on the money, I think. And I think the clerk's words are fantastic. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples, and look at this, nor blasphemed our goddess. That's really interesting. And I think it's interesting on 2 points. I think it's worth us reflecting on both of these points. I think for me, number one, it says something about the type of message that these followers of Jesus have brought. So you don't have to attack the goddess in order to present the message of Jesus. So I think that's worth. I'd like us to reflect on that. Is there a way of presenting the gospel without doing a number on Artemis? Do we have to attack Artemis to present Jesus? So the clerk seems to be suggesting they haven't done even in terms of the disagreement between their worldview and ours, they haven't used any language that has in any way blasphemed Artemis. They've presented, by implication, he's implying they've presented Jesus. I think that's worth a little reflection. And then the second thing is, I think the second part of the statement, or the first part of the statement, I'm doing it sort of reverse order. They have not robbed temples. So you've got 2 things here in this statement. They are law abiding. They have not robbed temples. And secondly, their message, though controversial, and their message, though different, hasn't crossed even boundaries of blasphemy in his estimation. Now, this is his view, so we're leaning into what he says about Paul and the team. But isn't it interesting? There are 2 elements to his defense of Paul and the team. Number 1, they're law abiding. Number 2, their message is not a message of blasphemy, even though they're presenting a different worldview. Their message is not a blasphemy against our goddess. Their message is a commitment to their own God. So there's a really interesting double idea there that I think even all through the book of Acts, I think Luke is trying to show us. I think writing to Theophilus, an object and subject of the Roman world, a Gentile believer, if he's a literal person, writing to Theophilus, he is writing a dynamic apologetic on behalf of the church. And he's actually saying a couple of things about the church, I think, David. Number 1, that the Church of Jesus Christ is not positioning itself as a rebellious, law-breaking organization. Let me use that language. A bit clumsy. And then secondly, that the message of the church doesn't need to blaspheme other gods. The message of the church is to present the story of God in flesh, Jesus Christ. And I think in his sentence, that potentially is weighted there. Now, again, as we often say together, we could be overcooking that. If you think I'm overcooking that, pushback. But I think this is why Luke reports this so fully. I think because even though there are elements of this that Luke clearly will not agree with, there are things that he's saying that help Luke's cause, and Luke is presenting an apologetic of those 2 ideas to the audience in general, and he's now doing it through the words of the the courageous, nameless city clerk.
It's interesting as you were saying that. I was thinking about there's a thread of thinking goes around in Pauline scholarship generally about the kind of categorized amongst academics as sort of Paul and empire studies, right? And you'll find whole books written about Paul's stance against the empire, right? Paul's critique of Rome, Paul's opposition to Rome. The people that don't follow that line of thinking, their argument is based on the fact that Paul kind of never says this.
Yes.
And I think it's one of these cases where you end up in almost an either or, and both end up being wrong. I think that what we're seeing Paul doing is what we're seeing Luke doing here, which I think is actually the lesson for us, is speak to truth, and the truth intrinsically holds a critique in it. Right? So, Paul writes to the Romans, and it's clearly evident that some of the things Paul says are going to cause problems for somebody who was trying to remain loyal to the cult of Rome, right? But Paul doesn't need to speak of that, Yeah. And what it does for me, John, is I think that, in fact, the only thing I think from the top of my head that Paul really aggressively says about empire is in Philippians. He says that Caesar's household sends greetings.
Yeah.
It seems that his work amongst the prisons has caused the gospel to spread, right? But you've got Paul saying things which are out of line with the beliefs of Rome, but never really mentioning Rome. You've got Luke pointing out through this story, like, listen, there's nothing really to pin on us here. And it draws me back, if you'll allow me to be imaginative, it draws me back to Jesus with Pilate. Right? Yeah. That Jesus with Pilate is, he's just not willing to get into a power battle with Pilate. Like, I have armies, but I'm not going to use them, and I don't need to answer these questions. And the fact that I don't look like a king to you says more about Pilate and Rome than it does about Jesus. But Jesus isn't perturbed by what Pilate and Rome think of him. I mean, I might be stretching it now too far there, but I wonder if we're actually seeing a theme of the gospel that doesn't need to go looking for people to throw bricks at. Does that make sense?
I totally agree with that, and I think the early church followed the pattern of Jesus. I mean, Jesus' message, we've talked about this millions of years ago in the parables and various reflections on the Gospels. Jesus' message is highly political, and yet it's not politicized in that sense. He's not making political statements per se, but the message of the kingdom of God has political influence. It has to touch society. So he's not necessarily preaching against something, but he is speaking for something. And as you said, I love how you phrased it, the minute we speak for something, there is an implied and sometimes explicit, but usually implicit critique of something else. If I speak to the one true and living God, there is then an implied critique of other gods in that respect. So we don't need to speak against. And of course, I love this. And I think it's a message we've got to remind ourselves in the 21st century. Remember, the early church is being birthed in the crucible of an empire in its zenith. And Rome is power mad. We are, again, it's remembering that we've got, probably under Julius Caesar, empire gets birthed in Rome, and then under Octavian, his sort of adopted son, what we would think of Octavian biblically as Augustus Caesar. The empire absolutely takes shape, and you get a real sense of this ravenous empire that's spreading across the world. And yet, Luke is showing us nowhere does the church engage in lawless behavior to forward its ends. And I think that's a reminder. And nowhere does the church have to blaspheme other gods to make a point about Jesus. Now, this is not compromise. I mean, no one would accuse Paul of all the people in the New Testament, you're not going to level compromise at someone like Paul.
Yes.
And you're not going to compromise at someone like Jesus. And yet, when we look at their language, it's hard to find direct criticism of the political system they're in, or direct criticism of other religious settings that they're in, or other cultural issues. What they tend to do is preach for. Even in Athens, Paul is positioning that. I mean, we've done 2 or 3 episodes on that. Even Paul is positioning it extremely positively, and I think what the model, the motif, the MO, the modus operandi of the early church in Acts is still speaking to us today. We don't need to cross the legal line. We don't even need to cross the religious line, and we can still be uncompromising in our commitment to Jesus Christ as Lord, even though we're neither lawbreakers nor blasphemers. Does that make sense? Like I think it's there, and I think the book of Acts definitely unpacks that. And Paul, I think in a number of his writings, unpacks that.
This is what I love about, even if you track the history then, the gospel, in my opinion, ultimately does conquer Rome. You're right. I mean, Rome's in its zenith, right? So, I mean, not only are they power mad, they are powerful, right?
Yes.
You know what I mean? They have gained the power, right? And a small group of people that have been raised in Israel or as Jewish people know full and well what happens if you try and oppose the Romans, right? So there's no naivety here about what's at stake. But the Christians don't seem to do that, except they just keep loyal to the gospel and they keep proclaiming Jesus. And then, a few centuries later, you end up with, the Christianization of Rome, which again, I know people have, views over what's really going on there. But you start to see Rome be unable to be the power mad force that it is once it starts to Christianize. And so in a really unusual way, if you can play the long game, ultimately the gospel does conquer Rome. It does make its way through the gospel, but not in violent means, which is the only way Rome understands conflict. And so because the early Christians aren't presenting themselves as a threat to Rome in the way that Rome can see threats,
Indeed,
the gospel can carry on doing its work. And I don't know. I mean, does that make sense? Do you think that resonates with what you're saying?
It does. And I think not only for me, does Christianity ultimately reach the heart of the empire and we could argue influence some of the outcomes of the empire, but of course. Magnificently, it literally outlasts the empire as well. I've had the privilege of going to Rome, and some of the buildings that the Italian authorities are having to work very, very hard to preserve were in their pristine magnificence at the time of some of these writings, and yet now they're crumbling dust. I mean, magnificent dust, it has to be said. Magnificent buildings, but crumbling dust nonetheless. And yet this kingdom that doesn't, let me quote the city clerk again, this kingdom that doesn't rob temples or blaspheme goddesses is still around. And it's still, you could argue, the fastest growing conversion religion in the world at this moment. So it has not only influenced Rome, it has outlasted Rome, because by and large, and there have been some terrible moments in world history, but by and large, we have avoided the power structures of empire, or we've tried to steer away from that. Now, again, I think where Christianity has tried to copy the Roman template, the empire template, that's when we probably have our darkest moments in world history, however you read those. But actually the call is we don't need to rob temples and we don't need to blaspheme. We simply need to proclaim Jesus. And here's the other little thought for you, David, just to reflect on. Now, this is potentially controversial, but I'll put it out there anyway. when we stay within the law, that's appropriate to do so, when we stay within the law, and when we refuse to blaspheme other religions, for example, is there a case that this story shows us it gives someone like the city clerk, not a follower of Jesus, as far as we can understand, an independent bystander, it gives him both permission and ability to defend us, right? So, I mean, if this was Luke himself standing up and saying these words, apart from, the Artemis stuff, if this was Luke speaking, we'll go, that's brilliant, that's absolutely brilliant. But this is, as far as we understand, a non-follower of Jesus defending the followers of Jesus. And he's able to defend the followers of Jesus because the followers of Jesus have not stolen from temples and have not blasphemed the goddess. Do you know what I'm saying? I know if people mishear me on that, I'm going to get my backside kicked. But actually, is there an argument here? Is Luke showing us the story because there's an argument that if Christians, followers of Jesus, behave in a way that's being modeled by Jesus and modeled by the early church, we actually give non-followers of Jesus opportunity to defend followers of Jesus because we're behaving like followers of Jesus. Is that is that a fair comment? What do you think?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, the opposite is very evidently true, right? That I think we're in a moment of, at least in the Western context, we're in a moment of church history wherein Christians are behaving regularly in such a manner that they cannot be defended by the city clerks, right? That our behavior is not. I think we're seeing levels of politicization of Christianity to the point that Christians are often being dismissed, not for what they say about Jesus, but for what they say about everything else. Right?
Yeah.
And I think that, so to your point, I thoroughly agree that sometimes, I mean, my goodness, if we're going to go down, let's go down together. I sometimes think, John, there's a lot of stuff out there that's being proclaimed as persecution of Christians, and it's not actually persecution of Christians. So let's imagine. Let me try and say this hypothetically. Let's imagine that Paul and his group, had been blaspheming the goddess and robbing the temples, right? Really what you're saying, if I hear you correctly, is, number one, that's not necessary. It's definitely not part of the gospel, but you're probably going to go to jail for it, right?
Yeah.
And if Paul ends up in prison, beat up because they were robbing temples and blaspheming the goddess, there's a part of you going, oh, he's not in prison for the gospel now.
True.
He's in prison because he just was aligning the gospel with his own intentions.
True.
And I think that's the thing that Luke's trying to show us. So I hope that sounds exactly like I'm agreeing with you, because I want to agree with you on that we blur the gospel sometimes, and we attach to the gospel things that are not necessary to the gospel, are just our own cultural biases, our own political positions. Like, I found this to be true all over the world. That and I was reading just this story just recently that a friend of mine had written in some notes that he gave me, and he was talking about this friend of his, and please, it's a true story, but I think it makes the point. So this gentleman went to Scotland from the USA to study theology, and so he arrived. He's from a pretty conservative theological perspective in the America, and he moves to Scotland, right? And he looks up the church of the same tradition that he is from, and finds one nearby the university he's studying. So he thinks, I'll go there on Sunday. And so he goes there on the Sunday, and everybody's lovely. Theologically, everything's very accurate. The preaching is brilliant biblically. Just great. And somebody says to him, "Oh, you're new. Would you like to come for a meal after church?" There's a few of us again together. So this man from Midwest USA goes with these brilliantly theologically sound Jesus-loving people, and he says halfway through the lunch he realizes they're all socialists. And he just says he couldn't believe this because
Yes.
everything he'd heard them say was absolutely aligned with what he had. But if these people were in America, they would be conservatives, and yet here in Scotland, they're not conservatives, and actually are uncomfortable with that idea of even being conservative with their theological. And he said it was such an eye opener for him that actually maybe these political positions are not as tied to these gospel and theological positions as we often think they are. And so forgive the long story, but I think it makes the sort of point that we've got to be careful that as we're navigating the gospel, we're going to meet people who are going to hold different positions than us. And one of the questions is, are those gospel opposing positions?
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And, and are those positions that actually sometimes if we were to act of them, we need to just accept they're not really, it's not necessary. The gospel doesn't need you to rob temples, really. That's kind of, does that align with what you're trying to say?
It does. It does. I think so. And I think it's trying to, I think, when we look at our world where, it seems that every cause has the right to act, sometimes inappropriately, even violently, on behalf of their cause. Right here in the book of Acts, Luke is showing us in a context where the followers of the way are being consistently persecuted for being followers of Jesus. They are not resorting to the sort of either behavior, retaliatory behavior, or law-breaking behavior that some people would say totally justifiable. If they are doing this, we should be allowed to do that. And actually, the early church, whatever they were persecuted for, they weren't persecuted for being lawbreakers. They weren't persecuted for being blasphemers or destroyers of other people's temples or burning down buildings, but actually they resist all of that natural expression of power and fear and insecurity, and they actually decide to go another way, and this has got to speak to us in the 21st century. And there are multiple layers, and we try not to grind out any agenda. We try to talk to principles of the text and let our listeners think through the agendas. But my goodness, I mean, just off the top of my head, if we wanted to, I could name a dozen issues that actually the modern church, especially in the Western world, is in danger of finding ourselves on the wrong side of certain conversations that we don't need to be in order to present Jesus. And I. Again, what I love about this, and let's try and finish this on an up note and a pause. But what I love about this is that Luke is showing us again the confidence the early church had in the fundamental message of the gospel. The fundamental message of the gospel is put Jesus front and center, keep talking about Jesus, keep putting Jesus into the mix, and then let Jesus sort this out. Let actually, when people encounter Jesus, then they're going to change. If people don't encounter Jesus and they hate Jesus, then the very best of the worst scenario is they hate us because of Jesus. They're not hating us because we're obnoxious. They're not hating us because our behavior is appalling. They're hating us because we are Jesus followers and they hate Jesus. And actually, to me, that's the right way round. They will persecute you, Jesus said, because they persecuted me. And yet Jesus actually walked in terms of legal stuff in society and in terms of the wider context of Roman thinking. Jesus walked a very, very restrained line, as it seems does Paul, and as it seems does the early church. So for me, this is really helpful. I want to be properly committed to a gospel that changes society, but we mustn't resort to the weapons of changing society that are not biblical weapons of changing society and are not gospel weapons of changing society. And the minute we think, oh, if we do that the way they do that, then we'll get the result we want, but we never will. And in fact, we'll not only end up losing the biblical argument in terms of Jesus, but we end up losing social credibility and even political credibility, because we are resorting to tactics that I don't think are necessary in the context of the gospel.
It strikes me again that we need to pay close attention to the passion narratives. We see Jesus refusing to engage Pilate on the terms that Pilate thinks need to be engaged with. But then, as you were saying that just there, just think about Jesus' words to Peter in the garden. See, if you live by the sword, Peter, you'll die by the sword. That is a message for the church. It's a message for Christians. That Peter, these people are coming at us with weapons, and we're not going to fight back with those very same weapons, because we then frame how things are going to be, and it's not good. And so I love that notion of what you're saying there, is that our challenge is to be people of the gospel. And when we start to be people of the gospel, but we sound and behave and act like people who are not of the gospel in order to achieve gospel things, I just wonder, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword, you don't actually end up with what you wanted. So that's it for this episode. We know that there's always more to explore, and we encourage you to dive into the text and do that. If you liked this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you rated, reviewed, or shared it. We also appreciate